Hi everyone. As Talia said, my name is Caitlin McCavour. I'm the soil specialist with Perennia. I know I've met some of you before, um, but one of the main things that Talia and I talk about when we're talking about tunnel space is actually a topic that I hardly ever talk about in the other commodities because it's high pH, and we don't typically have high pH in Nova Scotia. So today I'm just going to talk about that specifically, but just kind of an overview of nutrient management planning. So in the context of high pH, why you should be doing some more in-depth nutrient management planning, and then potentially some solutions to high pH in your tunnels. So as I said, typically in Nova Scotia, I don't deal with high pH, and I talk about pH a lot, talk about soil acidity a lot, but in the opposite way. So usually we're trying to increase our pH to somewhere between 6 and 7, where most plants like to have that pH, and there are some exceptions. So typically in Nova Scotia, we have naturally acidic bedrock material. Not everywhere, but most of Nova Scotia does. If you have naturally occurring organic matter decomposition, that's going to release some weak acids, which is going to decrease the pH. Most of our soils are what is considered podzolic or a podzol. And so this is what you see here in this picture. This is a natural forest soil in Nova Scotia. They don't all look like this, but these soils are characterized by this gray, really distinct gray horizon here, where nutrients are leached downwards through the soil profile, leading to acidification. And many of our forest soils are naturally like this. And then plant uptake can also lead to acidification. And then there's leaching. Fertilizer application can further acidify the soil, harvest, and then lingering impacts or additional acid rain. And so I have these separated just in two different colors here. So the yellow ones are ones that occur naturally, and then the green are ones that are anthropogenic causes of acidification. And leaching, you could put erosion in there too, but I usually put that in both categories because it is a natural process, but it's often exacerbated by management practices or by other human interactions with the soil. So this is just kind of continuing on this. So for plant uptake, this does naturally acidify the soil. It doesn't often acidify it by a lot, but there are some natural processes that occur. If you're harvesting, you're removing a lot of those base cations permanently from the system. So that can lead to acidification. And then again, we don't often have acid rain anymore. Well, I shouldn't say that. It's greatly decreased, and considering the amount we got in the mid to late 1900s, but it is still an impact, something that impacts typically our forests. So if you're putting something new into production, you're often going to have those lingering impacts from decades of acid deposition and just naturally acidifying processes. So most of the greenhouse soils that I've looked at have had pHs above 7. And I know not everyone will have this, but I've seen it enough that it's a common enough problem. And I know Talia has seen it in quite a few instances as well. And so some of the other things I just want to highlight, these are just some examples from different greenhouses, is that typically when I see the pH up above 7, I also see an excess in phosphorus and an excess in calcium in the soil, as well as pretty high cation exchange capacities. And so if we look at this, this is a soil test report from the same greenhouse in 2018, 2019, 2020, and 2023. And so some of the things I just want to highlight: between 2018 and 2019, there was an increase in pH of nearly 2.5. The organic matter is nearly twice as high. Phosphorus is 7.7 times higher. Calcium is 12.5 times higher, and the cation exchange capacity is nearly 5 times higher. So this definitely does not naturally occur within one season. So there was an amendment applied, and in this case, it was seafood compost that was applied at a high rate. And so in order for that to increase by that much in from 1 year, there had to have been quite a bit applied. And in the soil test, a lot of what was tested was likely the compost and maybe not necessarily mixed in with the original soil that was there. So that's something you have to be aware of. So make sure you're always sampling your soil, but also if you sample your soil 1 year and then sample the next year and you have drastically different results, even though you've applied amendments, they should be slightly different. But if you're seeing 12 times increase in some nutrients, you may want to retake that sample. So the other thing I just want to point out is there's a few consequences of having high pH. And one of the main ones is that it decreases the availability of iron. And so this is the same soil test report. Most of these nutrients that you see, I didn't go over all of them, but even magnesium, sodium, sulfur, you see these increases with that added amendment, but with iron you see a decrease. And so there are times where if you have really high pH, it can lead to iron chlorosis, which this is our perennia plant nutrient deficiency guide. And so you can look at that and look at the symptoms of iron chlorosis. If you have a continual high pH, this may be something you want to look for in your plants. So when I talk about pH and we talk about nutrient dynamics, I always talk about what's actually available to your plants. And this is really important. So just because the soil test report says that you have this much, it's estimating what's available. So it does a pretty good job of estimating what's available, but it doesn't necessarily mean that your plants are going to take that up. So in order for your nutrients to be taken up, they need to be in the plant available form. So different nutrients have plant available form. So for instance, nitrogen is nitrate and ammonium. You can't take up nitrogen in its organic form. And so for calcium, that's Ca2 plus, potassium, it's K plus. The nutrients also need to be in soil solution. So this is really important because this is where a lot of the action happens in soil. So soil solution is the water in between your pore spaces. So if we look at kind of a ideal soil, you want 50% solid, 25% water, 25% air. So you have that oxygenation, but you also have that water where you can have these soluble nutrients that plants can take up. They also need to be in relative close proximity to the root, depending on what type of mechanism those nutrients use to be taken up by the plant, and you need to have the right timing. So you really want the plant likes to take up nutrients at different stages of its growth. So that also makes a big difference on whether those plants are going to take things up. So when you think about nutrient management planning, and I think Talia will talk about split applications, but there are different times of the season, different growth stages, where plants are taking up nutrients more than others, or in higher amounts. So you want to make sure that you're matching your nutrient applications to when your plants actually need those nutrients. So you just kind of dive into the soil solution a little bit more. So it's this water in between this pore space. If you have these roots here, this is my kind of makeshift diagram. And you have all these different available nutrients. So calcium's in green here. These little blue ones are the hydrogen ions. So when you're measuring pH on your soil test report, this is what it's measuring. It's measuring the hydrogen ions in soil solution. So remember, it's a inverse logarithmic operation. So the more hydrogen ions you have in soil solution, the higher your soil acidity, the lower your pH. And so these ions can also bind to soil particles. So particularly if you have high clay soils, high organic matter, you're going to have those negatively charged sites. These are positively charged ions. So if you have a lot of hydrogen ions bound to those sites, that's considered your reserve acidity. So if you just go back up to a soil test report here, your pH is measuring your active acidity, which is what is in soil solution, and your buffer pH, which isn't something you really, the lab mainly uses this number to calculate the lime recommendation, but it's mainly that is kind of estimating the reserve acidity. So in order to neutralize your soil, if you're trying to make your soil less acidic, you need to neutralize that reserve acidity as well as the active acidity. And so when you're trying to make your soil more acidic, the same concepts apply. It's just we're not really particularly looking at hydrogen. We're looking at those carbonate ions that are there from liming agents. So in this context, when I'm talking about lime agents, I don't want to just talk about lime. So there's calcitic and dolomitic lime. So certain composts, particularly if it's seafood based, you have those calcium carbonate composition of the seafood. That is what is neutralizing that pH in your soil. You can also, there's other liming agents, so wood ash or biosolids or other amendments. One thing that I want to note is that the effectiveness of liming materials is different. And in order to determine the effectiveness of liming materials, you need to get them tested. So if you're applying lime, if your pH is low and you're applying lime, we know what's mostly in lime, but you can also get those reports from where you're buying the lime from. But it doesn't even hurt to get them tested. It costs about the same amount as a soil sample to test amendments at the Nova Scotia Analytical Lab. And so they have different effectiveness. So technically, pure calcitic lime is 100% effective or has a calcium carbonate equivalency of 100%. So something like dolomite is actually more effective at neutralizing pH. And so I think its calcium carbonate equivalency is around 108%. But something, if you had access to wood ash, it's more like 30%. So depending on where the source is, it varies. And compost would vary depending on the source and depending on how much it's composted. So it's really important to get those things tested and know what's in them. So how does it work? We kind of talked about this. I put the chemical formula up there in case people are interested, but we talked about how if you're adding this calcium carbonate, it's coming into the soil, and when it's in contact with water, the calcium ions will be released into soil solution as well as these gray carbonate ions, and they combine to hydrogen, and that's what neutralizes the pH because it's no longer active, it's bound to that ion, so it's no longer available for plants to take up. As well as calcium and magnesium. So magnesium is in dolomite, but calcium is a base cation, so it's not contributing to soil acidity, whereas hydrogen and aluminum are acidic cations. So when we're talking about the opposite, so when we're talking about making your soils more acidic, if your soils are alkaline, are above that 7 or 7.5, then basically you potentially could do the opposite, but there's some limitations with that. So I'll talk about that in a second. But so there is too much of a good thing. And I'm sure a lot of you have heard, and because of the part of the world that we're in where we have naturally acidified soils, to increase your pH, increase your pH, increase your pH. But really most plants, most crops prefer that 6 to 7 range. Again, they can tolerate a higher range than that, but that's not their preferred range. And I think this was from the University of Missouri. But it just gives you an idea that most plants don't like the pH above 7. So it's really important to get your soil test, know your pH, and look at those other properties that often are associated with pH, such as calcium, such as phosphorus. And so phosphorus, same as a low pH, is quite finicky. It really likes that 6 to 7 range. If you have below that 6, it'll often bind to aluminum or iron oxides. If you have above pH, it likes to bind to calcium and magnesium, and it's tied up in that way. And so it's often not available to your plants, even if you have lots of phosphorus in your soil. As well as plants, the microbial community prefers a certain range in pH. It's kind of that similar range. Different species prefer different ranges, and I won't really get into that because then I'd be forced to name species and I don't want to pronounce them. But if you have an non-ideal environment for your microbial community, they may not be able to perform those processes that they need to in your soil as effectively. And then I had kind of talked about this before, decrease in availability of iron, zinc, manganese. So particularly iron is a big one that you can see, but some of these nutrients become less available at high pHs. So how do you lower pH? So when I typed in to Google how to lower pH, these are the first four things that pop up. So in high tunnel, so applying elemental sulfur is one of the number one things, and that's a question I've gotten a few times. Applying organic matter, particularly peat moss, taking the plastic off and allowing natural processes to acidify the soil, and then adding acids to irrigation water. So I'm not going to talk about all of these because we can touch on them and maybe discuss some of them, but there are some of these is hard to find a lot of like really robust research, especially in this area of the world. And it's kind of more, some of them are a little bit more gardening hacks, but I'd be interested to see if anybody has tried to adjust their pH in lowering it, because we're fairly confident on how to increase pH, but we don't work in this part of the world with lowering pH as much. So the one I'd really like to talk about though is elemental sulfur. And so we often recommend elemental sulfur, particularly for blueberry production, because blueberries prefer that lower range in pH. They kind of want that 4.5 to 4.8 range. But typically what you're doing with elemental sulfur in a blueberry system is lowering it from, say, 5.3 to that 4.8. So your soils are already acidic before you apply that elemental sulfur. And that's a really key point because it's not as effective in alkaline soils. And so elemental sulfur needs to be converted to sulfuric acid for it to reduce pH. So this is done through a microbial process. And again, if your soils are really alkaline, if you're getting up towards that 8 range, those processes that are affecting this conversion may not be happening as much or may not be as effective because those microbes may not be happy. Alkaline soils typically have a higher buffering capacity. So this is indicated on your soil test report by that cation exchange capacity, which is typically a measure of how much clay and soil organic matter you have in your soil. Now, where you can't really modify how much clay is in your soil, but you can modify your soil organic matter. And so this is basically the ability of the soil to resist change. So we had talked about that reserve acidity or reserve alkalinity. So those ions that are being held on that cation exchange capacity on that soil organic matter that's high in your soil. In order for changes in pH to happen, you need to tackle the active acidity in your soil solution, and you need to tackle the active acidity or alkalinity on the reserve alkalinity or acidity on your cation exchange complex. So sometimes that makes it more difficult to occur because you have this high buffering capacity. And so often in alkaline soil, so oxidation may occur, especially if you have good aeration. And so that elemental sulfur may be converted to sulfate, which is the plant available form of sulfur. So your plants can take it up, but it might not necessarily be contributing to the acidification of your soil. The other thing that you want to watch out for is you want to make sure that you're not having excess sulfur in your soil. So if you decide that elemental sulfur may be an option to reduce your pH, you need to make sure that your sulfur levels aren't in excess or your plants can withstand additional sulfur, because that is also going to add sulfur to your soil. So as I kind of mentioned, the carbonates in your soil need to be neutralized before sulfur can act to reduce the pH. So you need to, that's that reserve. So when I talked about those hydrogen ions acting as a reserve, as your buffer pH, the carbonate ions behave the same. So if you have a lot of calcium carbonate in your soil, those need to be neutralized before your active pH can be changed. And so not saying that it's not an option, but be aware that it may need to be added in higher amounts, or it may need to be added more frequently in lower amounts to adjust the pH. And it takes a long time for that to occur. So it's not really an easy fix. So this was just kind of an example. If you're applying elemental sulfur and then this is the same diagram I've been using, it gets converted to sulfuric acid, and then you're releasing these two hydrogen ions. But if you have these free floating carbonates in your soil solution, they'll bind to that. And the hydrogen ions are not contributing to the pH as much. Eventually they will if you apply enough, but again, you have to be cautious that you're not over applying sulfur. So a few other methods of reducing pH. So remember, I know you talk about salts build up sometimes in high tunnel production. And so calcium and magnesium are also salts, and they're base cations. So if you're able to do flooding, if you have to get rid of those salts, like that should help with your pH. If you're removing your plastic at regular intervals and letting those natural processes, so leaching, occur in order to reduce your pH, that helps. And then the other thing that comes up a lot, and I did some research on this, but I'd be interested to hear if anybody has worked with something like peat moss or an organic amendment that is particularly for acidifying soils. And so peat moss, I think, typically has a pH of somewhere between 3 and 4. And it doesn't add a whole lot of nutritional value, but it does help reduce the pH of your soil if you're mixing it in with the soil that's already there. So a few things I would like for you to take away. First of all, I'm always going to say test your soil. Make sure you know what your pH is and you know what your calcium levels are, your phosphorus, potassium, all those things are before you apply amendments. And make sure that you are also sampling your amendments. If you're making your own amendments, you're making your own compost and you know what's in them, then that's great. But it still should be tested. The final product before applying onto your crop should be tested, because compost coming from seafood base, coming from a manure base, or coming from food waste or anything else are going to have drastically different chemical makeups and are going to apply different amounts of nutrients on your soil. It'll also help. So not only does it help with not applying excess. So that's kind of what I've been talking about today, applying those excess nutrients, but it'll help you identify where your limitations are. And maybe that amendment isn't the right choice that year. Maybe you have to find something else, or even just reducing the rates. So if you are applying amendments, so if you apply an amendment 1 year, it's the first time you've applied that amendment, and you take a soil sample after you've applied that amendment, a few months after you applied that amendment, and your results are drastically different from the year before, and things are in excess, don't apply more of that amendment until you figure out what's going on. And then if you do have high pH, so the other thing is there's a few ways that you can reduce it. So if you want to use elemental sulfur, just be aware that it's not an easy fix in alkaline soils. It behaves differently. Also, there are some different options, but the soil will eventually naturally acidify. However, that does take a long, long time. So it may take years before you see that pH naturally reduce itself. And that would be only if you're not applying any amendments that are leading to that increasing the pH. So if you're not applying those composts that are increasing your pH, that may naturally happen. But it takes a long time, and it depends on your soil type. And then, yeah, so I just put the peat moss there. The other option that I saw is often adding acids to irrigation water. I'm not as familiar working with that, but that can be something that that you think about as well if you want to reduce your pH. So I'm hoping that was helpful. If you have any questions, here's my email and phone number, and we can talk about things now. And like I said, I would definitely be interested to hear if anybody's had any luck reducing their pH, or if they've attempted anything, or if they've tried something that hasn't worked. Because again, I don't work with high pHs as much. And there hasn't been a ton of studies on it done in this region. So it would be interesting to hear what you guys have to say. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Caitlin. Um, so we did have a comment here that someone was able to lower their greenhouse pH from 7.5 to 6.8 using a combination of peat and using an irrigation water with a pH of 5.5.
Okay.
So that's pretty cool.
So how much peat did you incorporate? Do you remember? I don't know who made that.
Yeah, feel free to speak up. Tell us about how that worked for you if you want to. If you're shy, that's also okay.
Haven't found, okay, and then there's another comment, haven't found flooding with rainwater to have significant impact on pH.
And that's
Um,
typically, I mean, so I've heard flooding from like I'm putting excess water through the drip lines is not as effective as like I've taken the plastic off and left my tunnel
yeah.
for
I
a long period of
I
time.
always wonder, so I feel like it may depend a little bit on your soil type too. Same thing, like if you have really high organic matter and high clay soils, um, it's going to retain those nutrients a little bit more. So in really sandy soils with low organic matter, leaching occurs more readily. So that's kind of what you're trying to promote, that leaching process. But also if the water doesn't really have anywhere to go,
Mhm.
if it can't go downwards, then there's nowhere for those nutrients to go either. So when
And
the
so
in an outdoor system, there's more places for the water to go.
And so kind of part of our sort of like combined approach, I think that we're looking at to help encourage that salt leaching is putting in a cover crop, something like tillage radish. It winter kills, which is great depending on the time that you are able to put a cover crop in and are not actively producing a cash crop. So we just did an Ask Me Anything yesterday on cover crops. And the one producer said that they did tillage radish. They left it in through the winter. It died just through the cold temperature. And it was like all that was left behind in the soil was like a bunch of these holes from where the radish
Mm,
was. So it really helps to break up any compaction that might be getting in the way of that water movement and that kind of purposeful leaching that we're trying to get
yeah.
done
I
there.
wondered too with the cover crops, like if you have excess calcium, if you can look up like a heavy feeder of calcium or something that might work in your system, um, just to promote that plant uptake of calcium.
And beets, I think we found sugar beets as a potential that can help take up excess calcium. Um, if you are going to do that, you do have to pull the beets out. You can't just let them decompose because obviously then you're not removing anything, but that could be something worth playing with. We have very anecdotal and very limited evidence of this, but someone did try one bed with beets and another bed without, and then the cover crop that they planted following up was like the performance was much better in the bed that had had beets grown and removed compared to the one that didn't.
Hmm,
So, like, it's happened once on a very small plot in a greenhouse space, but yeah, could be kind of cool to play with.
mhm.
And so just to go back to that first comment about lowering pH, so it took 2 to 3 years. They added peat at a rate of one 3.8 cubic foot bale per 180 square foot bed once or twice a year. So yeah, that's awesome. Thanks for contributing that. And then another comment here that they've used muriatic acid in their irrigation to work with their soil pH.
Um, Oh, I had something to comment on before, and now I can't remember what it was. Might come back to me. No,
So,
yeah, that's interesting.
has anyone shoveled snow into greenhouse to have the effect of flooding? I have heard yes, that people have done that. We have a lot of snow right now to go around, so as long as you don't have a crop growing in there. I've even heard people who do tulips sometimes, they'll just shovel snow on top, sort of as their water source. Maybe not when we have like multiple feet, but yeah, I think that could be worth a shot, Catherine. And just sort of on that note of like where we're talking about flooding, a lot of the time I think we focus on um, like a winter flooding period and kind of making the assumption that that is the period of inactivity. But there are a handful of people who maybe aren't producing in the summer or, have sort of a short window in the spring. So it doesn't have to happen in the winter for it to work. Obviously, I think historically, July and August, you're probably not getting as much rain, but obviously, based on this last year, we don't really know what to expect anymore. So I think any opportunity we have to open that up and kind of limit the impact on your cash crop, the better. But I mean, and realistically, like in talking with Judson Reed last year about, managing salts in high tunnels, um, it's not something that has to happen every single year. It's sort of about implementing like a schedule that works for you. And once you kind of get that pH under control, like once every few years, kind of time it with your plastic removal slash replacement. And you should be able to maintain that nicely, as well as like managing your amendments, of course, as well. Okay, so if we don't have any more questions for Caitlin, I am gonna jump back on and we're just gonna go through a super quick example here for calculating split applications. Okay, so as Caitlin had alluded to, we are going to talk a little bit about calculating a split application. We did a lot or a few webinars anyway, and we have a fact sheet on sort of why we want to do this. But we're basically allowing ourselves to deliver fertility to the crop throughout the growing season. We can target sort of the different growth stages of that crop. And it also allows for quick and easy adjustment of our fertility based on crop feedback and test results. So it allows for sort of on the fly adjustments as opposed to I've applied once and now what is done is done. And I want to just do a quick sort of shout out to fertilizer labels. So we're going to use 20-20-20 as an example here. This is sort of a general fertilizer that we can see a lot in conventional systems. But if we open up the actual label for this, we're going to see that there is a dilution rate or a dilution table on this particular label. And so this is really cool because it actually starts to look a little bit at the saltiness or sort of I don't know if purity is the right word to describe it, but we can get a sense of how much salt is actually in that particular mix. And so this really comes in handy where we might be comparing the same mix from different suppliers, especially where the cost is still going up and it's still quite expensive. Some of you might be looking for alternatives to kind of your tried and true that you've always been using. So I definitely recommend take a look at this dilution table. So it kind of says at a concentration of 50 ppm nitrogen, we're looking at an EC of 0.2. So if you're finding that, say, if you're looking at a potential substitute and that value is much larger, that's just an indication that that alternative method is maybe saltier compared to the one that you have been using. So yeah, just something to look out for. I think this is typically more on conventional fertilizers as opposed to organic ones. But yeah, I think that's a pretty nifty tool. So we're going to just go through a quick sample calculation. I've chosen two amendments here. I've focused on organic, but a lot of the calculations can be applied to a conventional fertilizer as well. We're going to focus on cucumber as our target crop. And so we're going to be looking at about 200 pounds of nitrogen per acre for our cucumber crop. And we're going to go through two different scenarios. We're going to look at a 50% pre-application of nutrients, and then we would be delivering the remaining 50% through the drip. So this is more of, this is more of something we would see in a soil-based system. But then we're also going to go through an example where we're applying 100% of the nutrients through the drip. Again, just to show kind of how we work those numbers, and they aren't drastically different from each other. So if we think about doing a 50% pre-application, our pre-application target for cucumbers then is going to be 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre. So if we've chosen an amendment like feather meal, which historically is not as salty as something like chicken manure or seafood compost, which is obviously why I chose it, we will just go with a product that is reported 12% nitrogen. And so if we're looking at applying 100 pounds at the beginning, we have a 12% nitrogen amendment. We can divide 100 by 0.12, and that's going to tell us that we need 833 pounds of feather meal per acre as our pre-plant volume for that cucumber crop. Obviously, 833 is a big number. Keep in mind that we are looking at 100, like the per acre size. So if we have a greenhouse size that is 1/10 of an acre, then we're looking at about 83 pounds of feather meal sort of before we put that main crop in. So we've calculated that pre-application amount to be 83 pounds of feather meal for 10% an acre. So now what? So we have a remaining 100 pounds of nitrogen that we need to deliver to that cucumber crop throughout the season. And so Easy Grow is the amendment that I've chosen here. What I like about this one is that we have an 18% nitrogen. This is allowable, I believe, in organic systems. Definitely check with your certifier on that, but I'm confident that this is an option that you can use. And I believe it's a hydrolyzed pea protein. And it's very easily dissolvable in water, so you can run it through the drip lines. And it's a little bit easier to work with compared to something like fish. So again, we're going to look at the amount of nitrogen that we're looking to add. So again, that's going to be 100 pounds. We're going to divide that by our 18% because that is the amendment concentration that we're looking at. And so we're looking at about 556 pounds of Easy Grow per acre in our growing season. Again, if we're dealing with a 10% of an acre in our greenhouse, then we're looking at 55.6 pounds. So we've now established how much of our Easy Grow we need to buy to supplement our crop. We know how much feather meal we need to buy, and we know sort of the timing of how we want to apply that. So we've gone in with our pre-plant application. We've determined how much Easy Grow we need. How do we actually decide how much Easy Grow goes in at a time? So if we look at cucumber production, let's say that we're running our crop for about 5 months. That translates to about 20 weeks, could be 21, 22, but really we're just looking at kind of defining that production window for whatever crop that you're growing. And then so we simply take that volume of product that we want to apply through the growing season, and we're going to divide that by the number of production weeks. So if we have 55 pounds, we're going to divide that by 20 weeks. Now we're looking at 2.78 pounds of our in-season soluble fertilizer to go onto the crop per week. And so ideally, because we're looking at sort of providing consistent fertility for the plant and trying to limit sort of these like big bursts of fertility and then, dropping off to almost nothing sort of towards the end of the week. Ideally, we are providing that product throughout the week between 2 to 3 applications. So once you decide on how many applications you want to do on farm or how many make sense for you, we're then going to divide that 2.78 pounds of product per week by your number of applications to figure out how much has to go through the drip at any given time. And that's basically it. So we'll run through sort of a quick 100% in-season application. So this looks a lot more like what we would see in a hydroponic system. It's definitely an option for soil-based production, but for those of you who are still sort of wanting to come in with a pre-plant or come in with a compost or something like that, then sort of that 50% calculation is going to be the one that you want to look at. So if we're looking at 100% in season, this is going to be a very similar calculation. We're just going to be dealing with a little bit more of that soluble fertilizer. So again, we have our target for cucumbers at 200 pounds nitrogen per acre, and our amendment is an 18% nitrogen source. So we're going to divide our 200 pounds by 0.18, and so we're looking at 1,100 pounds of that product in season. Again, then adjusting for the size of our greenhouse. So if we're looking at that 1/10 of an acre, we're looking at 111 pounds of easy grow for the duration of that season. So then we want to define that period of time that we're going to be in production. So again, we're going to stick with this 5 months or 20 weeks. And so we're going to divide that 111 pounds by 20 to give us 5.5 pounds of product per week. And then similar to our 50% sort of pre-plant, 50% applied in season, we want to see sort of an even distribution of that product through the drip throughout the week. So I've decided that I want to apply 3 times throughout the week. So we're looking at 1.85 pounds of product per application. We're going to do that 3 times a week for 20 weeks and have that be our plan. So as we all know, sometimes our plan is not going to work the way that we want it to. And one great tool that we do have to sort of assess whether or not our program is working is going to be using in-season tissue tests. We can obviously always look at the way that the crop is looking, like this image here. This isn't really what we want to see. There's obviously something else going on here. The tissue test is a great way to sort of figure out what has actually been taken up by the plant from the soil. So the soil test almost acts as like the library, the reserve. This is what we can have available to us, but what is the plant actually accessing? And so the Department of Agriculture does have a vegetable crop tissue sampling guide. So this is a great place to sort of reference what your crop tissue test should look like. So then you can compare your results to what is published in this guide to figure out how you stand. And so in this particular example, our target for potassium is 1.6 to 3, and our tissue test has come back at 1.4. So ideally, I would like to see more potassium in that tissue, especially if we're sort of in that early to mid to heavy harvest period. And so I've included this because, you know, we have our program, we've done our tissue test. How does this value now translate to what I'm putting through the drip? So 1.4 compared to say 1.6, if we're looking at the lower limit of that range, is about 87% lower than our target range. And so if we want to increase the amount of potassium that we're feeding through the drip by at least 13%, we're going to then fall into that range, ideally. So then we would take the value that we determined in our calculation, we would add 13% and then say, okay, so next week I'm going to add 13% to my 1 to 5 pounds, whatever that value is. And then a few weeks later, I would say probably 2 weeks, then I would recommend taking another tissue test and just seeing where that potassium is falling. And so this is a really cool sort of feedback loop for us to understand how effective our plan is at delivering the fertility that we want to deliver. And really just to make adjustments in season to make sure that we're sort of hitting those crop needs. Quick question, do I recommend testing drip EC? Absolutely, I do. So this is something we see in hydroponic systems a lot. Especially if you're feeding, if you're doing 100% of your fertility through the drip, I think looking at your drip pH and your drip EC is just a good idea to make sure that your mix is coming through your dosing system the way that you want it to. Again, these systems can be a little bit finicky. So even though, you're putting in the right amount of acid, you're putting in the right amount of fertility, it might just not be drawing at the ratio that it needs to kind of come in at that target pH or EC. So I don't have any more calculations for us to play with. So if you guys do have any questions, this is kind of a good time to go through it. This session was recorded, so I will be posting this online. And we do have a fact sheet on perennia.ca on managing greenhouse nitrogen, and I believe that there are some sample calculations on there as well. And typically when we're looking at these greenhouse soils, kind of throw back to that perfect memory you have of what Caitlin threw up with those soil tests. A lot of the time for a soil-based tunnel system, our biggest concerns are going to be supplementing nitrogen and potassium. We typically have tons of phosphorus, tons of calcium, magnesium, and then a lot of the sort of smaller dose nutrients are typically okay. And then it's really just about identifying then those nitrogen and potassium sources that don't have a lot of those additional hitchhikers that are going to contribute to already very salty soils. Yeah, and then okay. Can excess sulfur inhibit the uptake of other nutrients? So I don't know, Caitlin, I thought maybe that was something we had talked about.
Yeah, so sulfur is actually really good for promoting nitrogen uptake. So it's good in that respect, but it has some interactions with other nutrients. And let me look at what's the name of that chart that I use all the time? It shows all the nutrient. One sec, guys. I'll bring it up.
While she's looking, I will say, I have seen a scenario, and this is like in a strictly hydroponic recirculating water situation. I have seen a buildup of like sulfates and sulfur. I believe they were using sulfuric acid to sort of manage their pH. I did find that you were seeing some issues in that particular crop, but that would be more of a, like, again, very specific to I'm recirculating my water, sort of the crop is taking out all of the stuff that it wants, all of the nitrogen, potassium, calcium, and then all that's left is that sulfate coming through. Then obviously you're going to get some deficiency symptoms there.
So sulfate in its form is in its plant available form is SO4 2 minus. So it's an anion. So it doesn't directly compete with the cations. So it would behave more similarly to like ammonium. Nope, sorry, nitrate. Sorry, nitrate is a anion, not ammonium. Ammonium is so it doesn't. So I remember what I was going to say before. So excess calcium is an interesting one because there isn't really it's not technically toxic at high levels. The issue is that it can outcompete like potassium. You'll often see potassium deficiencies when you have excess calcium. Um, and so that interaction doesn't happen with sulfate directly. The issue with sulfur is it being converted into that sulfuric acid and leading to excessive depletions in pH. And that's what we saw when we had acid rain. We had so much sulfuric acid on the soil and it decreased that pH, so that then calcium, magnesium were not available, but it doesn't directly interact with those, but it does help with the uptake of nitrogen because it contributes to, I think, like amino acid building, but it does help with nitrogen uptake. But it doesn't have an antagonistic relationship with those other nutrients because it's an anion as opposed to a cation. Hope that somewhat answered that question.
Yeah. All right. Yes. So I think that was some good discussion. Obviously, if you are seeing some weird stuff in your tissue tests or your soil tests or your crop, you can definitely reach out to myself and or Caitlin. And yeah, always looking at getting a better understanding of how this is working. And like Caitlin said, it's quite funny, or not funny, but it's shocking to look at a soil test with excess potassium or sufficient potassium and still see signs of potassium deficiency in the crop, just because we are dealing with more competitive salts in there. So that's that. All right, guys. Um, so I don't really have anything else for you guys today. So thank you guys so much for coming. Our next meeting is going to be March 13th at 8:30 a.m. And we're going to look at product efficacy against botrytis. So if you don't have any more questions, then we can call it here, and I will see you all in a month.